continuing to follow the reactions to the death of Jordan Neely in the New York City subway system. There were protests in the last few days, some people actually going onto the tracks, preventing the subway cars from continuing in response to the chokehold death of Jordan Neely, who died after another passenger on the train put him in a chokehold, allegedly in response to him making harassing or uncomfortable comments on the train. Not clear how much, if any, danger he was actually putting under the passengers, but in response, Daniel Penny is the name of the person who initiated the chokehold, and he died as a result of that. So a lot of dialogue on the internet about it, a lot of protest actions. The protests is people actually going onto the subway tracks so that the subways, so that the cars couldn't come. A lot of actual disruption to the subway over the last few days, as I understand it.
Yeah. Folks are upset about the idea that someone who had not put their hands on anybody on that car would be restrained by the Penny, a former Marine, and put into a chokehold for about 15 minutes when that ultimately resulted in his death. And so I think, regrettably, so much of the conversation is about what someone would have the right to do if they hit another passenger, because in the past, Neely has been involved in actual physical altercations. In this case, he wasn't. So there was a prematurity to the chokehold. And of course, if the restraint had been a restraint that didn't result in death, we'd be, I think, in a very different posture rhetorically as well. But it was a restraint that ended in death. And now there has been some additional audio that people have been pointing to that indicates there was some warning that the restraint was too severe or going on for too long. A conversation had by people in the car. This is as reported by the Daily Mail. Someone who can be heard but not seen warned Penny that Neely had defecated, which he feared was a sign that he was dying. From his experience, I think he referenced the fact that his wife had experienced in service as well, saying, quote, "He defecated on himself, you're going to kill him now." This was a warning that was given to Penny. Another man who was helping Penny restrain Neely replied that it was an old stain on Neely's trousers and that Penny was no longer squeezing Neely's neck. He's not squeezing, the voice can be heard saying, "All right," because after he's defecated himself, that's it, you've got to let him go. He then warned Penny that he might be facing a quote, murder charge because of his actions. At that point, a second man turned to Neely and said, "Hey, can you hear me?" Neely did not respond. Penny did not speak, but then released Neely and got to his feet. The unidentified bystander can then be heard saying, "That was one hell of a chokehold, man." After 3 minutes and 50 seconds, Neely appeared to then converse and take a deep breath. And of course, we now know that he died.
We also saw a lot of reporting on, honestly, a number of city resources that had been put toward helping him. Obviously not enough, but he was on this list of 50, I believe, sort of homeless, notable people, homeless individuals known to the city that and as a result of his previous interactions with, he had 42 arrests for different things, 3 of them described as unprovoked attacks on other passengers or people on the street. He was as part of a arrangement where he would not be prosecuted for whatever one of the most recent things was. He was supposed to be basically checking in with a mental health court, but then had stopped meeting the requirements of that program. And he's had just so many interactions with law enforcement, the mental health court. They were trying to get him the help he needs, but it's. I think it just shows you how tough it is, honestly, with because he was known to the city. He was known to the mental health authorities. He was on a list that specifically they try to get him or people on the list in touch with mental health resources. So there were a lot of entities, both city and just charitable or helpful, trying to do the right thing for him, and even that was not at the end of the day.
Well, I mean, it's important to know that the reason why that wasn't at the end of the day helpful is because someone who wasn't the city, someone who wasn't even the police force, intervened, vigilante style.
He was still, it wasn't enough because he was still having psychotic episodes in public spaces.
Sure. And the reason that we're talking about this case is not because he was mentally ill in public, which unfortunately is the case for a lot of people across the country, but because the crime that was committed here, and I'm not saying that his previous record I don't think it's necessary to vilify him or turn him into a folk hero. The fact of the case.
There is some turning him into a folk hero.
Right, and there's a lot of people who are saying because you have a record of interactions with the police or the social service system that you deserve to die. But the situation here is that this wasn't police getting involved. This wasn't a choice to incarcerate him. This wasn't a choice to charge him with something and throw him in jail. This wasn't a choice to put him in a mental facility and take him off the streets. This was an unsanctioned civilian who made a choice to intervene and as a consequence killed a man. And the question is whether or not that was ultimately going to result in a charge, whether or not he's going to be charged with some kind of involuntary manslaughter or reckless manslaughter, because some combination of the words that were said, the warnings that were given, might have indicated that he should have not put Neely in a chokehold for as long as he did. And that's the kind of dangerous behavior that can result in the loss of human life, which I believe substantially is valuable on its own terms, regardless of the record or priors of the people involved. And if someone had in turn strangled Penny to death in retribution or pulled him off of Neely and then killed him on the train, that also would have been wrong and that person should go to jail for it. It's regretful that Penny put himself in this situation, but this is what happens. When you kill somebody, there are often consequences for it, which is why I think there should not be an encouragement of this kind of vigilantism, especially, and this is such an important point, especially because in this instance, Neely hadn't actually laid a finger on anybody. And are we saying that we want to live in a world where if someone's shouting on the subway, we're going to give citizens free license to strangle them to death?
I don't think we're saying that, but we should not have as a default state, there's just crazy people shouting at people on the subway, making them feel intimidated. Maybe not in that case, but in other cases, lashing out violently. Right? Obviously, no, we don't want to encourage vigilantes.
We got to figure out what to do that.
Yeah.
But the crime here, the assault that happened here, the physical assault that happened here was not by Neely. The only physical assault that happened here on this train was by Penny, and that's the thing. Like, if someone had acted in a different moment, we would be in a very, very different case. What's so disturbing, I think, to a lot of people and why there are these protests is that because the facts of this, I think, are frankly very inconvenient to Penny, because there was no physical assault by Neely, because Neely died and wasn't just restrained but died, there is a framing of this that I think is completely going to other instances that happened to justify why someone in Neely's position might be justified in another case that just wasn't the case that happened here. Well,
right, but I don't think he meant to kill him. Obviously, we have more information to learn about this, but it seems like he meant to restrain him, and it resulted in his death. So there's a little bit of what was his motivation that is not going to fit
Sure,
murder.
But that's why we have things like negligent homicide. That's why there's rules for this sort of thing, and I think that there wouldn't be as much. Look, I completely can see that there is a projection of intent onto Penny that has not been proven. That is inappropriate. But it is also the case that there is a projection of intent onto Neely and a projection of actions that didn't take place onto Neely that are being used to justify the behavior. I
mean, there's rules to all the things. I mean, he had 42 different infractions of, so we don't care about all the laws he broke or all the things he did wrong.
As far as we know about those because he was in the criminal justice system and those were being addressed when they were addressed.
But instead they gave him chances. They said, well, you don't have to be prosecuted this time. You can do X, Y, Z things instead. Didn't do those things over and over again.
Right. And this day on the train, none of those previous moments was the result of him being killed. He was killed because he shouted. Penny did not wait for an escalation. He chose to address what, like it or not, many of us, all of us who live and are from New York have experienced on the train, which is a homeless person, shouting person, etc. And all of us, I've never been in a physical altercation. I've never killed somebody. I've never asked for someone to kill someone on my behalf on the New York train system. And Neely, who is, I believe, from Staten Island, but not from New York. Staten Island has the least density of trains, so I don't know what this man's experience is. I'm not want to project anything onto him. Sorry, Penny rather is from Staten Island. He chose to preemptively put his hands on Neely and put him in a chokehold that resulted in his death. And that's the only crime we have here to deal with today. That's the one. Neely never murdered anybody. Sorry, I know people are touchy about that word. I'll retract the word murder.
There was a crime.
I'll retract the word murder. Neely never killed anybody.
I mean, he was on the subway illegally.
Right.
Yes.
So one person that had a fare evasion, another person killed another human being.
Routinely over and over and over and over again. I mean, again, so rules need to be enforced, right? Or we're just not going to have them, or everyone should just walk on the subway and not pay for it, I guess?
Fare evasion doesn't get you a death sentence.
Right. But, I mean, it didn't... Look, we obviously we know what we're talking about here. Most people want to make the subway a safer, less prone to outbursts from crazy homeless people.
Sure.
Lee Fong, I don't know if you saw this, he had a great Substack post yesterday about how a lot of the left-wing groups, including the New York Civil Liberties Union, Vocal New York, had opposed the mayor Adams, who all these groups, saying that he was murdered, he was lynched, et cetera, but opposed the plan to involve more mental health, to have more mental health officials pushing
my understanding
people toward
the opposition wasn't opposing more mental health practitioners. Eric Adams' choice was to address the homelessness on the crisis of homeless people on the train with more police officers.
If they wouldn't go voluntarily when the mental health people asked them to, then it would allow the police to do it forcibly. But wouldn't you say that's a better outcome than what we see here is just random people doing the job that the police should be doing?
Yeah, I absolutely think the police should intervene to prevent people from getting killed on the subway train by vigilantes. Yeah, I think murder is horrible. The police's priority should be preventing people from killing other people on the subway. Could they do that by intervening to have people who are not supposed to be on the subway and should in fact be in mental health facilities? I strongly support fully funding mental health facilities, strongly support mental health and housing facilities. Yeah, I don't think anyone is even arguing against the funding of the mental health facilities. Well, people absolutely are. And the New York City police budget keeps going up and the social services budget does not. Now, I will say, to your point, social services were very much involved in this case. And it's being characterized a little bit as a failure of those systems, but sometimes they're really tough cases, and it's kind of admirable, in my view, that this person was known, that Neely was known, and there so many efforts had been made to correct his situation and improve his situation. And who knows how successful they might have been with more time? We'll never know, because this is a 30-year-old who is now deceased, whose mother also tragically was strangled to death. By a boyfriend or this partner. Is a tragic life and a tragic outcome. And I have no issue talking about the ways in which Neely also caused a lot of drama and fear and problems on the subway. But having such an interest in talking about that, and people who, I'm sorry, Robby, it feels like there's more of a weight at times on the idea of someone stealing $2 or $2.35, whatever it is now, and fare evasions, than someone getting killed. I mean, there's no effort to stop the former, so you could just evade as much as you want. There's cops being paid an enormous sum in taxpayer money stationed all across the city trying to keep fare evasion from happening, believe you me. I think it would be great if they did that a little bit more. This situation wouldn't have happened if he wasn't on the subway. Him being on the subway and fare evasion are two different kinds of things. People are going to get on the subway even if they pay to be on the subway. Other cities... I don't think he was paying to be on the subway. Other cities take a different approach and say we don't care about fare evasion. It makes no sense for us to be paying cops overtime salaries, huge sums of money, more than what is actually being spent on costing the public transportation on fare evasion. A lot of cities in the wake of COVID actually decided to just move to a free system because ultimately it's public service and they think that there are benefits in terms of, climate benefits, keeping the roads cleaner and freer, not having to maintain roads, not having to issue traffic tickets, all those kinds of things by simply making public transportation free. So again, I just don't want to get away from the core issue that there is a legitimate culture of fear, I think, on the subway, that everyone would like us to be living in Japan where everything's quiet and clean and there's no issues or no safety problems whatsoever.
You sound kind of dismissive when you say it like that.
No, I don't know how else I can say it. I genuinely want that to be the case. And I think as a society, we should be actively strategizing to figure out what's going on and why our mental health crisis is so much more exigent, because there are mentally ill people all over the world not in this scenario.
Yes, we have to take mentally ill people, put them in facilities, they have to take antipsychotic medication.
But right now, what happened?
What we have to do.
Well, again, for a libertarian, I feel like I have a lot more liberty interests, concerns in these scenarios than you do. I think that there have to be protections so that you can't just lock people up and say that they're crazy and throw away the key.
But we can no.
So
you can tell who is crazy. It's not like we're crazy in the colloquial. These are people who are shaking, who are living on the street, who have violent outbursts, It's not just like, oh, you have some crazy ideas, they can lock you up or something.
I'm not going to
it's so obviously
psychiatric
different.
Requirements for incarceration. I'm saying that they exist, and that's the only reason I'm not nodding and agreeing with that. Is because I think we should be very careful about the substantive liberty interest of Americans. That's one of the founding principles of our country, and I don't think we should throw that out the window the second we're talking about someone who is mentally ill. Mental illness comes in a lot of different types of ways. It's not all permanent. There's a lot of things that are going on with people. All I'm trying to say is, all that aside, I agree that should be a committed goal of the public and not something that's just brought up when we're supposed to be having a substantive conversation about the fact that a man named this former Marine,
Daniel Penny, killed Neely. That's what happened. Neely, on that day last week, didn't touch a person in that subway car. It seems like he was disruptive and unpleasant, but he did not touch a person on that subway car. That day, right.
Right. And Penny, not knowing a thing about Neely's background or behavior, and that it is not fair to bring that into this scenario in terms of what motivated Penny's behavior, Penny made a choice to put a stranger in a chokehold and keep him in that chokehold for 15 minutes until he died, or died shortly thereafter. And people are going to have to reckon with that piece of it, regardless of what you think about how we should handle mental health issues and things like that, because there was a lot of agreement on that issue. So people are trying to make this, I think, into an issue where there's a lot more public support, where there's not a lot of public support against strangling people.
I haven't really heard anyone saying that they think that was the right way to handle the issue. I am not seeing
Robby.
a lot of... Well, it resulted in his death. I'm not seeing people say he did the right thing. If this situation happened again, he should do that again.
I think a lot of people are saying that he was
that
justified in his action. That's the whole point of bringing in all of his priors to say, well, this is what happens when people are crazy. This is what happens if you allow homeless people in the subway. C'est la vie. No, it's not what happens.
That could be true. But
it's literally not what happens, because we all have lived in New York our entire lives and never had that happen. This is a controversial event because of how rare it is for something like this to happen. Do I think that we should have to live in this tension with folks who are obviously in distress, who are in economic distress, who are in mental health distress, who are clearly not doing their best? No, of course not. I'm not downplaying
the vagrant, mentally ill impose. They're in distress and pain. It's not kind for them to leave them in the condition they are, and it imposes a social cost because people wonder what to do about it, especially when they're in confined spaces with them. So this was not the right way to handle it, but we need...
Well, I'm glad we can agree on that, because unfortunately I think there is a much more disagreement about that than you believe that there is out in public. And so I think if we could start with human life is valuable, and folks shouldn't be killing people for nonviolent harassment in subways, then we could be, as a broader community, be having much more productive conversations about what to do about homelessness and mental health crisis that exists
all about bringing down the violence on the subway, period, or anywhere else.
Including the vigilantism.
Including the vigilante.
All right. Okay. I'm glad we can agree. More Rising right after this.